Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
We are facing the most serious threat to public media in history. Right now, the White House is trying to rescind already approved funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, money that keeps stations like ours running. Without it, essential local journalism, trusted reporting, and podcasts like this are all at risk. If you value public media, speak up now. Visit boisestatepublicradio.org/funding to learn more and take action.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We will get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Caleb Radel, KUNR's Mountain West News Bureau reporter, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, and Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, along with Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer. I want to welcome everybody to the show. Happy Friday.
Good to be here.
Happy Friday, Jim.
And Brian, let me begin the conversation with you today with the threat to our public lands. Can you begin just by reminding us of this amendment that was put in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill?
Sure. So this is a reconciliation package. It's basically a budget bill that starts in the U.S. Senate, and it has the unique thing about it is that it can get passed with a simple majority under the rules of the Senate. It can get past the filibuster, so Democratic votes aren't needed to pass this bill. And a change was introduced by Senator Mike Lee of Utah, which requires the sale of something like 3 million acres of U.S. Forest Service and BLM land across 11 western states. Montana is specifically exempted from it because the senators there have expressed strong opposition. And the stated purposes are to raise revenue and to provide for affordable housing, but it places huge swaths of public land across the West at risk of sale at the auction block.
Okay, I want to talk next, Brian. As you mentioned, 11 states are threatened by this, all Western states. But do we know at this point, Idaho specific, what public lands are threatened if this, if this bill passes?
Yeah, we have a pretty good idea. The Wilderness Society, the way the bill works, it exempts certain categories of public land from sales. So these would be things like national monuments, national historic areas. There's a whole list of them. And the Wilderness Society put together a map and an analysis that you can find on their website that shows all of the land that does not meet one of these exemptions and so could be eligible for sale. There are about 21 million acres in Idaho. It's actually expanded from when I wrote. One example that I gave when I wrote is that there are 9 peaks in Idaho that are over 12,000 feet, and among peak baggers like myself, it's one goal a lot of people have is to summit them all. The access to or summits of 6 of those were eligible for sale at the time of writing, but since the language has been further changed, it's now all of them.
Wow.
There are huge swaths of public land basically everywhere you look. There are big sections of the Boise foothills that would be eligible, big areas of the mountain ranges near McCall, big areas near Stanley and Ketchum, basically all of the access to the Teton Range in Wyoming from Idaho. That's near where I live. So there's huge areas of land.
So, Brian, you mentioned that Montana would be exempt from this because their senators, and I believe one of their senators was a co-sponsor of this amendment with Mike Lee from Utah. And they've pushed very hard to keep Montana out of it. That would be one reason why they agree to this. With that said, our congressman Mike Simpson has voiced much opposition to this. What about our U.S. senators, Risch, Crapo? Have they spoken up? Have we heard anything in regards to where they stand on the threat to our public lands?
So far, I'm unaware of any statements at all from Senator Jim Risch. Senator Mike Crapo, through his spokesman, gave a statement to the Idaho Mountain Express a couple of days ago, and that indicated that he is against the sale to private entities. That does potentially leave some wiggle room for things like
Mm,
transfers of federal lands to the states. And as I've written about in the past, and many others have, the long-term effect most likely of a federal land transfer to the states, given the cost of administering these types of land, fighting wildfires, things like that, is an eventual sale of that state land, because the state simply couldn't afford to keep it. But Crapo at least has said that he is opposed to the transfer to private entities, while he hasn't said anything explicit about transfer to state government.
hmm and Brian, can we talk a little bit too about how this really isn't a partisan issue? This is actually one issue where Republicans and Democrats, historically, in particular in Idaho, have always come together on this issue. And just anecdotally, all you have to do is get on social media, and it seems to me that it doesn't really matter what camp you're in. Everyone, well, I shouldn't say everyone, but the majority really seem to be against this, yet we have only heard from one of our, senators. Again, Congressman Simpson has always been a big advocate for protecting our public lands. But with all that said, Brian, what in your opinion um, is is so serious about this threat and what it could do to really our way of life, not just in Idaho, but in the West?
So the biggest threat in my mind isn't necessarily the sale of 3 million acres. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the biggest threat is the precedent that it sets. Congress has big spending priorities. The Republicans, particularly in Congress, have worked hard to cut taxes again and again and again. We have a very large debt. Once the signal and the precedent has been set, to politicians in Congress that you can take care of some of these problems by selling public land, you'll see little piecemeal sales like this every year. Every year,
Mm.
there will be more access lost. There will be more pieces of land lost, and we'll slowly start, uh, just winnowing away our access to grazing, our access to hiking, climbing, to outdoor motorsports, horseback riding, all kinds of things, until the state is more like states in the East, where there is very little public land. I lived in West Virginia for a little while before coming here. And for example, if you wanted to fish, it was remarkably hard to do. There were very few places where you could actually get access to a river, because all the land along the rivers is privatized and it's fenced, and people own little river lots. So if you can't afford a river lot, it's very hard to even get access to a river. It's hard to find some place to hike. It's hard to find some place to climb, anything like that.
All right, appreciate that update, Brian, and all of us will be paying attention to this as it moves forward. Drew, the owners of a mine in Valley County recently said there is room for expansion. Now, before we get into all of that, can you give us a brief history of this mine?
Absolutely. So you're of course talking about Perpetua Resources and the Stibnite Gold Mine.
Mm-hmm.
This is a site in far eastern Valley County. It's kind of near Yellow Pine, um, that has been historically mined since the turn of the 20th century, and especially during World War II. And then off and on up through the 90s, and it sat for a couple decades before Perpetua got involved, then known as Midas Gold, in 2009. Since then, they've dumped more than $300 million into exploration and permitting the project. And then just earlier this year, received regulatory approval to move forward.
Okay, so Drew, earlier this week, then Perpetua outlined its plans for a potential expansion. So tell us about this potential expansion.
That's right. So during a shareholder meeting on Wednesday, the company revealed it has more than 2 dozen target zones where they're interested in doing further exploration, based on observations they've already made of mineralization in these zones. Um, this is, it would be some time before anything
Mm-hmm.
came of this. Like I said, they started exploration in 2009, on the main project, and here we are in 2025, and that's just moving forward. So that gives you an idea of the pace that these things tend to move at. But nonetheless, it gives the company an option to extend the life of mining beyond the 12 to 15 years it currently envisions.
So Drew, the mine though that they're talking about has it? It hasn't even opened yet, right? It hasn't been built yet. I mean, there was a mine there, but there was a lot of work they would have to do to, even though they've got this approval. Am I remembering this correctly?
You're spot on. Yeah. So they did receive regulatory approval, the big approval anyways, from the Payette National Forest earlier this
Mm-hmm.
year. There's still a handful of what you could call punch list items to kind of check off, but certainly the big permit they needed has been secured. Um, Construction has not yet started at this point. Perpetua remains optimistic that it'll happen sometime later this year, although just candidly, I mean, we're at the end of June, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
very short building season up in these high mountain areas. Um, but nonetheless, there's still some time. They won't have a full season even if they do begin this year. But they might get to turn some dirt. Regardless, it would take 2 to 3 years to develop the mine to be ready to actually process ore.
And if they were to expand, as they said earlier this week that they have that ability to do it, I mean, Drew, what about approval for that?
Well, certainly that would trigger further review, presumably by the Payette National Forest as well as other regulatory agencies. Obviously, it depends on the scope of what's proposed. All we know at this point is that they've got these additional zones, and that if everything went as Perpetua dreams up, it would be up to 2.4 million ounces of additional gold added to the
Mm,
company's reserves. Now, to put that in perspective, the project as it exists today um, has 4.8 million ounces. So this will be about a 50% total increase in terms of the gold associated with the project. Now, that doesn't even include the potential additional antimony that could be added.
hmm
Um, Now, antimony is not necessarily the moneymaker on this project, but nonetheless, it is another component of it.
Logan, ever since the Idaho Parental Rights Act was passed, it's been under scrutiny, with many critics saying it's actually doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. So, before we get into all of that, can you give us some background on this and actually what this law is and what it does?
Absolutely. So the Idaho Parental Rights Act is a piece of legislation that the state legislature passed in 2024, so not this year, but last year. And basically, it says that parents have supreme control over their children, and the consequence of this is parts of the bill have to do with medical treatment, and specifically requiring that parents have to give consent before their children are able to receive medical treatment.
Hmm
While it was not explicitly cited in the legislative debate, this was kind of happening around the same time that the legislature was passing similar policies to allow counselors and medical professionals to turn down care if it violated their moral beliefs. And although this is not explicitly in the legislation, my read of the situation is kind of a concern that perhaps LGBTQ children are being affirmed by doctors in ways that parents do not approve of. Um, but this piece of legislation was written and passed in 2024, and it basically says that parents have supreme control and direction over their children, including their medical care.
Mhm.
This has been on the books since last year and has caused a few issues, which I think is what we're going to talk about here.
Yeah. So Logan, the one issue that I want to focus on, and many medical professionals brought this concern up when this bill was going through the state house, even before it passed, and this is things to do with sexual abuse issues, in particular things like ordering a rape kit. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Because what these medical professionals have said is, look, a lot of times, a parent may be the accused abuser, or they are maybe covering up for someone else. So a child doesn't have the ability to get that medical care. And so can you talk a little bit about what some of this fallout has been?
That's exactly right. And when the legislation was passed in 2024, advocates and as well as some policymakers were saying we might be overcorrecting here and taking away some
Mm-hmm.
power from teenagers. You think of people who are minors under 18 but may still be teenagers. Think of that like 14 to 18 range. If they're sexually active with their peers and want to go get STD testing, they might be embarrassed and not want to tell mom and dad about that, or more banal things like simply accessing behavioral health or the 988 crisis suicide hotline. But
Mm-hmm.
here, the what we're talking about specifically is, like you referenced, the horrible cases of incest, abuse, rape, etc. A rape kit examination is a medical procedure. So if you're going to have a minor who needs to get one of these procedures done, if it, heaven forbid, is a parent or guardian or a step parent who is the one accused of committing these crimes, and you have to get their permission to look for evidence of the crime, that causes a lot of conflict. And this week, my colleague Ruth Brown over here at Idaho Reports, she spoke with Amanda Cook, who is the Forensic Nurse Examiner Program Director over in Idaho Falls at
Mm-hmm.
the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Center. And she has said that the minors who she treats are largely are largely kids and teenagers whose parents are not in the picture and often can't be contacted. So if there's no one to give permission for these minors to get medical help, her hands are tied as a medical professional.
And Logan, that was something that really struck me, is that that interview with Amanda Cook that Ruth did, because you know this is just routine medical care that these teenagers can't get. I mean, I believe in the article that Ruth wrote, she even mentioned like one teenager whose grandparent is their guardian, but the grandparent was incarcerated, so they had no way of getting this, consent, and so then these kids are left without even being able to get basic medical care.
Yeah, quote that really stood out to me from Amanda Cook in that story is, "We are causing so much havoc. They have no autonomy. The legislators have totally screwed it up." I think that really lays it out really clearly. And a part of the angle in this story too that we have up on idahoreports.org this week is this piece of legislation made it through the state house in about a month from when it was
Mhm.
introduced in committee in 2024 and to when it was signed by the governor. Even with his concerns in his transmittal letter, it took about a month for this legislation to become the law of the land in the state of Idaho. And now that we're actually living with this policy and living with the effects of it, the key policymakers who are ostensibly in charge of fixing these issues are saying, well, we shouldn't be surprised it's going to take 2 or 3 years for us to get all the kinks worked out before we can get some sort of legislation passed. And I
Okay, Logan,
I think that disconnect is notable.
that was the part too that stunned me. I have to say, is that when we have lawmakers, including the governor, who says, "Well, this can take 2 to 3 years to get right," and I mean, and I think the pushback can be, "Well, get the bill right before you pass it into law," because the next, so they didn't do anything to fix it during this last session. The next session, legislative session, doesn't start until January. So, does that mean that any potential fix will have to wait until the next session? And they may not make any fixes to it because they didn't this last session.
Right. They didn't do nothing this last session. I do want to be clear. The
Okay.
Senate acted and passed a piece of legislation, kind of under the guidance of Senate President Pro Tem Kelly Anthon, who is a senator from Burley and the current head of the Senate. He was the sponsor of that original bill, and he's been very clear that this was not his intention with his original bill. It was more about philosophy and the ordering of the rights, not necessarily. Um, he says it's been misconstrued and overinterpreted and interpreted to be stricter than it is. So he was able to get a piece of legislation passed through the Senate. What happened when it hit the House side is the House members were kind of unaware this was coming down the pike. And then House Speaker Mike Moyle from Star, he said that he had lots of House members coming up to him with amendments to be made to the bill, and they're just in the House's eyes was not enough time to get all these loose ends tied up
Mm.
before the end of the legislative session. So when I spoke with Moyle, it's been a few months ago now, but he was pretty clear that this is an issue that they know they need to fix, and hopefully with the House on board now, knowing it's something that the Senate has reached a something that they see as an appropriate fix. Hopefully, with the House on board, they'll have a little bit of momentum behind this in January. Otherwise, it would take a special session of the legislature to do anything before January. And that's really unlikely especially on an issue
Yeah.
like this when we have so many other things going on in public policy right now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Appreciate that update, Logan. Caleb, some parts of the Mountain West have already seen triple digit temperatures. In fact, in Boise on May 31st, they saw a triple digit day. And today is actually the first official day of summer. So, can you talk to us about a new analysis that was released, and how climate change is impacting these hot summers? And can we start with who conducted this research?
Yeah, sure. The research was done by Climate Central. They're a nonpartisan research group. And what they did is they analyzed summer temperature trends over the US across the last 55 years.
So, Caleb, what did they find in terms of more hot days than in the previous 55 years?
Yeah, they found that back in 1970, most cities didn't feel what Climate Central describes as extremely hot summer days, strongly influenced by climate change. Now, they're talking specifically about the buildup of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which, as many know, is primarily caused by the burning of fossil fuels for energy, transportation, heating, cooling. So now, fast forward 5 decades, on average, most cities experience at least 6 of those extremely hot days
Oh,
every summer. And quite a few cities in the Mountain West are well above the average. Some are even double that amount. Grand Junction,
right.
Colorado, for example, averages 18 brutally hot days every summer. Salt Lake City averages 13. Twin Falls, Idaho, 11. And then here in Reno, we average 9. But I think we're probably going to exceed that this summer, if I had to guess.
Okay. So Caleb, I mean, with those numbers and with these days increasing, it seems every summer we have hotter summers. Any hope for this trend changing at all? Because some people there are still critics out there saying, well, it's not climate change that's doing this.
Yeah, I spoke to Caitlin Trudeau. She's a researcher at Climate Central, and she said she doesn't expect extreme heat to be slowing down anytime soon. And she pointed out
Mm.
that the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere last year spiked and grew at the fastest annual rate on record. So essentially, she said, if we continue to burn fossil fuels, we will continue to have more brutally hot summer days.
Mm. Okay, appreciate that update. Emma, the West Bonner School District, Emma, passed a critical school levy back in May. Can you begin by telling us about this levy?
Yeah, so West Bonner in May passed a $4.7 million 2-year levy with 60% support, which is a big showing for up there. And the levy prevented the district from going into dire straits financially. They would have had to close 2 of their elementary schools, leaving them with just one
Mm.
elementary school and then a junior senior high school open. So the levy passage was really critical for the district.
So, Emma, even though school trustees have said they are very grateful for this levy, I mean, as you just noted, they don't have to close these schools, et cetera. but they still have concerns. So what are their concerns, and why do they have them?
Yeah, so this week, West Bonner had their budget hearing for next year, which is a step towards approving a school district's budget. All the school districts in the state have to have their budgets approved next month. So West Bonner had their budget hearing, and they have had a rocky few years, especially when it comes to their finances, and they're behind on their audits. So they have not had their fiscal year audit done for 2023 or 2024 yet. And that's a big delay. And so the state has withheld funds from them multiple
Mm,
times. And then the district files a hardship request to get those funds back. So currently they're out about $170,000. And they are on track, their business manager said, to get those audits done over the summer. So they're expecting to get the 2023 audit done in the next few weeks, and then hoping to have the 2024 audit done before school starts again. And then they will have to start on their audit for, well, this financial year that's ending next month. And they're going to be delayed on that one. But they've already been in communication with the State Department. So they're hoping to get caught up. So that's one factor, is
hmm
sorting out their past budget issues. But also they have, despite passing the levy, their budget is tight. For example, their food service program is in the red. Despite the high poverty up there in the district, not enough students and their families have signed up for free and reduced lunch, despite qualifying. So there are issues like that that the district still has to sort out.
So, Drew, a citizens group is planning on filing a complaint with the Attorney General's office. This is regarding St. Luke's McCall, and it's about taxpayer subsidies. So, can you explain how these subsidies work currently?
Absolutely. So this is kind of a product of a bygone era, if you will. So before St. Luke's Health Systems took over operations of the hospital in McCall, it was known as the McCall Memorial Hospital. The McCall Memorial Hospital was established in 1956, and along with it was the McCall Memorial Hospital District, which provided taxpayer property taxes to help fund the hospital's operations. Now, the district, it encompasses essentially all of the McCall and Donnelly areas, basically Northern Valley County. And so at present, the district collects about 1.5 million per year in property taxes from property owners in this area, the McCall Donnelly area, and
Mm.
then turns around and allocates it to um, projects that benefit healthcare in the area. Um, that's the current arrangement.
Okay, so Drew, the citizens group, which is called Give Us a Vote, says that these subsidies are in conflict with state law. So, can you explain their argument to us?
Sure. So with these subsidies, the issue that the Give Us a Vote group has is that there has been no competition um, for this taxpayer funding. All of it has been used for projects affiliated with St. Luke's McCall. Um, in theory, the funds could have been used for, EMS in McCall,
Hmm
McCall Fire and EMS, something like that, or alternative providers. That's never happened. In fact, no alternative proposals have ever been sought. These funds have just been redirected to St. Luke's um, ever since 2010, when St. Luke's did take over control of the hospital's operations. Um,
So,
the Gov group says that violates the Idaho Constitution because essentially it's a public subsidy that has primarily a private benefit because St. Luke's McCall is profiting
mm,
off of these various things that the district is providing money for.
so Drew, St. Luke's took over this hospital back in 2010, as you just mentioned. So, those subsidies, if I'm understanding this correctly, were in place prior to St. Luke's taking over, correct?
That's right. When it was a taxpayer operated hospital, when it was because essentially the facility was owned by the district and then later by the county. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they would in turn use a contract to have for a long time it was actually St. Al's was running the hospital. That
Mm-hmm.
changed, I think it was 99 or 2000. And St. Luke's wound up getting the contract. Um, and so it made sense in that time, because again, this was a public hospital at that point. But at the point that St. Luke's took over, it became a private facility.
Mm. Okay. So then this group, Gov, as they call themselves, wants an advisory vote on this issue. So tell us why and what they hope that would do.
Yeah, so this is the advisory vote. It would be non-binding. It would essentially it would be during an election cycle. Initially, Gov had hoped for this past May, the hospital district board, which has the power to authorize this advisory vote or not. They felt May was too soon, and so then we kind of looked toward November. The hospital district uh, put together a task force to kind of study, what exactly would dissolution of the district entail. That task force has met a handful of times, and last month uh, reported to the board and kind of said, hey, we maybe want to consider this advisory vote sooner than later because the results are non-binding and they kind of inform the next steps. If it's a landslide
Mm-hmm.
in favor of dissolution, then okay, let's sit down and figure out what all that entails. Just because it's a landslide in favor of dissolution, though, doesn't mean dissolution happens immediately. There would be time to execute the various different things that would need to happen to facilitate that.
Okay, and Drew, it seems like what Gov is finding out is how slow processes can be. So is this one of the reasons why they now intend to file a complaint with the AG's office? And when they do, when will this happen?
Absolutely. So that is one of the reasons they were a little bit disillusioned by the district's deliberations following the task force recommendations. The district essentially said, "Hey, we still don't feel completely comfortable with what happens if we do end up moving towards dissolution. We want to study it more." Um, to Gov, that was unacceptable. And so yes, they escalated this to the Attorney General's office. Now, one thing to be clear about here and to understand is that the complaint to the Attorney General's office does not concern dissolution directly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's a separate issue. The Attorney General can't tell the hospital district to dissolve. Um, this is more so asking the Attorney General to weigh in on the hospital district's practices. One other key thing to understand, I think, about Gov's argument is that St. Luke's McCall's service area is significantly larger than the hospital district's tax base. I mentioned that
Mm-hmm.
McCall Donnelly area that taxpayers are contributing to the hospital district, but taxpayers in New Meadows and Council and Riggins and all these areas that St. Luke's McCall regularly receives patients from, there is no taxpayer subsidy from those areas. And so one of Gov's fundamental issues is the inequity that exists there.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Thanks for that, Drew. And that there is a new teacher minimum wage requirement in Idaho. Can you tell us, begin by telling us what it is and when this was passed?
Yeah. So, my coworker Ryan Soupy really has tackled this in a few stories on our website. So, the state policymakers approved 5% raises for teachers and pupil services staff for next school year, so the 25-26 school year. But school employees shouldn't expect to actually get 5%. And that's because school districts often hire more teachers than the state funds, and they often pay through those teachers through supplemental levies. So there's
Mm,
that piece of it, the 5% raise. But then back in 2023, the legislature gave an additional $6,359 per teacher to K through 12 districts and charters. But some school districts, really many school districts, didn't include those raises in their starting pay. So for the 2023 or 2022-2023 school year, the minimum pay was $41,500. With that $6,000 and some change raise, it went up to $47,859. This school year, the new minimum is $50,252 per year for a starting teacher. But there are still about 20 school districts in the state who paid less and paid that $41,000 minimum. So that's a really big
Oh,
bump for those school districts.
okay. So with that said, Emma, part of the issue then also is the question of equity, right? Because you don't want to be paying a teacher who is a first year teacher the same amount as maybe you're paying a teacher who's been there for 5 to 10 years. So are they struggling with this issue of equity?
Yeah, so part of the issue here and kind of what I focused on this week in my story is that a lot of school districts were surprised that this 5% raise this year was based on that $47,000 base pay. So it was $40,000 plus 5% for this year. So that's a bit more than they were expecting. And so districts were surprised. And it's a pretty tight budgeting timeline for these school districts.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to create their budget. A lot of them were running levies in May, and then they have to negotiate with their teachers' union. And those teachers' unions, like you said, they don't want a starting teacher to make just as much as a teacher with 5 or 10 years of experience. They want to see that increase spread across their pay scales. And so the State Department told Lakeland School District in North Idaho that stipends or extra pay are not part of the base salary. And so districts should not rely on that, that they should just be paying $50,000 as the base pay. But then some school districts, like Coeur d'Alene, also up here in North Idaho, they decided to pay out stipends to about 10% of their teachers because they said it was just a really condensed timeline to fully renegotiate their entire salary scale with their teachers union in just a few weeks. And so I asked the State Department about that this week, and they said they have provided guidance to districts that the legislature's intent was to include this new funding in the base pay. But ultimately, school boards have the final say in each district what their contracts with their teachers look like. So districts are trying different approaches, and we don't know exactly how it's all going to shake out and how many districts are going to rely on stipends, how many districts are going to rewrite their entire pay scale, or if districts are just going to meet the minimums
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they feel like they can do at this time.
Caleb, tell us about this new report from the U.S. Geological Survey that says 10% of our nation's energy could be supplied by geothermal energy, and we're talking from the Great Basin area.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Gemma. So yeah, there's a massive amount of untapped geothermal energy, what many people call the heat beneath our feet in the Great Basin, as you mentioned. And for those
Mm-hmm.
unaware, that includes most of Nevada, about half of Utah, parts of Idaho, Wyoming, California, and Oregon. And the USGS found that region has the potential for 135 gigawatts of baseload geothermal energy. As you mentioned in your question, that could provide 10% of the nation's electricity demand. And right now, geothermal contributes less than 1%. But, and there's a big but, in order to get to 10%, USGS scientists say that would require widespread development of what's called enhanced geothermal systems. Now, this is a newer technology. It uses fracking techniques similar to oil and gas drilling, where they inject water into cracks of hot rock to create artificial reservoirs, and then they extract that heat to generate energy. Now, the U.S. Department of Energy is testing the system. They built a project in Southwest Utah called Forge. It's basically a hub for them to advance geothermal energy through technologies and research and development. And the agency's goal said for geothermal to contribute 10% of our energy, they're hoping to get to that point by 2050. So we're a little ways
Wow.
away.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. So, Drew, if you've been to McCall, there's a pretty iconic tree in downtown, but city officials say it's in danger. Can you begin by just telling us exactly where this tree is?
Yeah, so we're talking about the large Engelmann spruce tree in Art Roberts Park. It's kind of right across from the ice rink on Payette Lake, right by the Bering Wall sculpture, if you're familiar with that one.
Mm,
I
okay.
always say it's the most photographed place in McCall, that sculpture.
Yeah. So, city leaders say the tree is showing signs of poor health. Drew, do they know why this is happening?
Yeah, so McCall Parks and Recreation Director Kurt Wolf, who is also a certified arborist, he he admits it's difficult to prove, but he is completely confident that the reason the tree is showing signs of poor health is for road salts. The chemicals that ITD as well as the city of McCall put down during the winter to melt snow and ice from roadways. If if you look at and there's a picture on valleylookout.com with the story, but if you look at the southeast face of the tree, which would be the face nearest to passing by traffic on Idaho
Mm-hmm.
55 right through downtown McCall there. Um, that face, which would receive the most spray, does in fact have noticeable thinning of the limbs on the lower parts of the tree.
And Drew, in your story that you wrote, you also talk about these road salts potentially being blamed for issues with other trees in the Valley County area. Can you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, so all up and down the Idaho 55 corridor. I mean, and next time you come to McCall, I mean, get past Horseshoe Bend and just pay attention to all the evergreens up and down the highway, uh, particularly right by the side of the road. And you'll notice that a lot of them have kind of an orange brown color to them, as if they're dying or as if there's a needle blight. This
Mm,
has been talked about for a couple of years now um, on social media as well as by ITD, the Forest Service. They're the Forest Service and ITD have certainly not been ready to say that it's the road salts that are causing it. There's a host of other factors that are at play. It could be uh, pests. It could be humidity, just emissions, any number of different things that are causing that needle blight.
mm-hmm,
One important thing to also note is that the blight is not seen as these trees dying. It's simply seen as a disease of that year's needles. And so there's some optimism that it may improve. But for the time being, yeah, there's a lot of conversation about, well, what exactly is causing this?
mm-hmm. So, Drew, getting back to this tree in McCall, what is the plan then to try to make sure that it gets healthy, that it won't die?
Well, the city plans to ask ITD to either stop or at least reduce the use of road salts in that area of downtown. That's one alternative. I'm told that the city will approach ITD later this summer and should have a plan before going into next winter. Another option, and this is more on the city's side of things, and I found this wildly interesting. Uh, the city may consider basically refreshing the soil around the tree each spring. That is to say
Hmm.
that, all these fugitive road salt particles that come up in that road spray and migrate over there toward the tree and settle into the ground, they may just dig up the soil and replace it with new soil each year to help reduce the salt loading. Another option is there's evidently sorts of plants and shrubs that could actually be used to absorb some of those salts. And so that they might plant those around the tree. So those are some of the mitigations being considered right
Mm-hmm.
now. I'm sure we'll know more certainly by next winter.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. We've been speaking with Caleb Radall, KUNR's Mountain West News Bureau reporter, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, and Brian Clark joined us at the beginning of the show. He is Idaho Statesman's opinion writer. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money Podcast from NPR.